everyone. I am Sable. Lomax pronouns are she and her. And I'm so very excited for today's episode. What is it? It is episode 4, Radical Communication with Chris Miller from Ben and Jerry's. Just so you all know, back when Hannah and I, so Hannah is our CEO, Hannah Naima McCloskey, when we were discussing season 2 and we realized we wanted to speak with folks in this space and who do this work at different companies and organizations. And we had there's the folks in your network and there's the folks that, you admire, but you don't necessarily know. And just so you know, Chris, Ben and Jerry's was on the admire list for different reasons that we'll get into as the episode continues. But I want you to know on a personal level, I am so excited to have a chance to talk with you today. Fearless Futures is as a whole, but I, Sable, the personal human being, am excited for the opportunity to chat with you. So it is midway through the day, Chris. Before I read your bio, how has your day gone thus far?
It's getting better by the minute. I'm excited to spend the next little bit of time talking about the work we try and do here at Ben and Jerry's. Thank you for those kind words, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, okay, let me jump in. I would love to say that I have an impeccable memory, but I do not. So for everyone listening and who will be listening later, I am indeed going to read Chris's bio. So Chris Miller is head of global activism at Ben & Jerry's, a unique position within the corporate world focused on advancing social justice through the day-to-day operations of an ice cream company. He leads a global team across 9 countries responsible for development and execution of the company's advocacy campaigns that are rooted in its progressive values. Ben & Jerry's has a long history of running campaigns on issues as diverse as support for mandatory GMO labeling, marriage equality, voting rights, and the need to address systemic racism and white supremacy. So again, looking forward to this conversation. Before I jump in, head of global activism is just not a title that you hear. How did this role come to be?
I stepped into I was the first person to take this job about 9 years ago. And, as you know, Ben and Jerry's was founded about in 1978, so that's 44 years ago, by these 2 counterculture hippies, right? Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield. And, Ben had dropped out of college and Jerry didn't get accepted to medical school. They were great friends and they decided to go into business together. And they kind of knew that they like to hang out together and they like to eat. And so they sort of landed on ice cream. But, they sort of created this business model. They sort of rode the first wave of what we now would call sort of corporate social responsibility or a triple bottom line approach to business, right? But when Ben left the company, nobody owned the sort of advocacy and activism work at the company anymore. And, it sort of resided a bit in the marketing team and a bit with some of the other members of the social mission team. It didn't have a home. So about 9 years ago, the then CEO, Jostein Solheim, and the head of the social mission team, Rob Mahalik, sort of came up with the idea of, hey, let's bring someone in who's got some campaign experience to sort of take this work forward. And so, my background was in policy and advocacy. I started my career working for Bernie Sanders. I spent half a dozen years at Greenpeace leading the climate change campaign in the US. So my background was in policy and advocacy. So it is a unique job, right? There aren't a lot of companies that have people like me, that used to work at Greenpeace and hung banners off of coal plants, coming into a big, for-profit global multinational company to kind of do this work. So, it is a unique role. And we've now built a whole team of people that sort of have the similar kind of experience that I have doing this work in, as you suggested, 9 countries around the world.
I'm loving to hear that. Not just the discovery of we don't have someone to hold this important role that was birthed with Ben & Jerry's no longer has a home, that it has grown, because oftentimes in organizations, it's a large task and then it's like one or two people who were charged with carrying this task through, and it's like we need a little bit more human resource
Mm-hmm.
than that to really be able to navigate these issues. Okay, thinking about your background, and this could be pre Ben and Jerry, so this could be Greenpeace. I mean, this could be when you were in college, Chris. But what was kind of your like equity mic drop moment, if you will, where it kind of like introduced you to this world, if you will, of there's some language here to inclusion and equity, and there's inequities in the world, and so forth and so forth. Like if you had to go back, what would have been maybe not the first mic drop moment, but just one of them potentially?
Stating the obvious, Sable, I am a white man who grew up in the second whitest state in the country, right? This here in Vermont. You know, this is an ongoing journey for me and for my colleagues, many of my colleagues at Ben and Jerry's who look a lot like me. I am fortunate to have a mother who was both progressive and politically active. You know, I have memories of being 8, 9 years old and being a part of elections and supporting progressive candidates here in Vermont. So I had a very young and early interest in politics. I guess, you know, if I were going to point to a mic drop moment more recently and think about my current role, every year at Ben and Jerry's we have a gathering of our franchisees. So we have I think about 600 scoop shops around the world, about 300 in the US. And every year, at least prior to COVID, we would gather as a Ben and Jerry's family. And at every one of those meetings, our co-founders, Ben and Jerry, have an opportunity to address the group. And the meeting in January of 2015
Mm-hmm.
had been in the wake of Ferguson,
Mm.
Trayvon Martin, and this sort of string of high profile, captured on body cams and
Videos,
social
yeah.
media feeds, right? Killing of Black men by police officers. And Ben came to that meeting in January and he stepped onto the stage when he and Jerry addressed the group in a shirt that said, "Hands up, don't shoot." And he went on to talk about the values of Ben and Jerry's
Mm-hmm.
and the values of Ben and Jerry's rooted in the concept of justice, economic, social, and racial justice, and that if Ben and Jerry's was truly the company that it said that it was and that held these values, that it was incumbent upon the company to take a stand
Mm-hmm.
in support of Black lives and against police brutality and the over militarized policing of America. And it was a pretty, I'll be honest, you know, Sable, at that time, you know, January 2015, standing in front of a room of mostly white people, it didn't, it was not without some controversy. There were some
Yeah,
members of the franchise community that actually got up and walked out of that meeting because they
I can see
perceived
that.
Ben as being anti-cop or, but for me and for those of us who are charged with doing this work at the company, we walked out of that ballroom that afternoon and said, "Ben's absolutely right. Like, if we are this truly this company that fancies itself as furthering the pursuit of justice,
Mm-hmm.
we have to get engaged in these issues." And so that started what has been, you know, now a 7 year kind of journey on this work. And it started with pulling a bunch of people together, thought leaders on these issues, and starting what became a learning journey, but ultimately doing what we do, which is using our platform and our privilege and our place within culture and our power and our media budgets to advance the strategies of people who are on the ground and impacted by systems and structures that perpetuate racism. And so, as a long answer to your mic drop moment question.
No, but honestly, it was the perfect answer, because one of the things that we have admired from afar is how vocal and upfront and radical and honest that Ben and Jerry's has been on issues without trying to skirt around the issue, or the topic, at hand. And, we don't like to put people on pedestals. We don't want to put, like, those of us who do this work, us at Fearless Futures and other organizations and firms who do this work, you never want to put yourself on a pedestal. But there is something to be said, especially in the corporate space, to take such a stand and a vocal stance and a loud stance the way that Ben and Jerry's does. And I have this written down because I didn't want to misquote, but when I think about the press release, so this is a couple of years back with Silence is Not an Option, where you state, amongst many things, what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis is the fruit born of toxic seeds planted on the shores of our country in Jamestown in 1619, when the first enslaved men and women arrived on this continent. CNN called it extraordinary, and I'm sure other news outputs and media companies said the same. And when I think about the story you just told with the mic drop moment of Ben, standing in front of all these people, having the shirt on and saying what he said, and then thinking of you've all said numerous statements, over the years. How do these statements come to be? Because there's so much happening in the world on any given day in any given country. How do you all decide, okay, we're going to say something about this, and then this is what we're going to say? Like, what is that process at Ben and Jerry's?
It's interesting, right? Because most companies don't have people like me sitting around talking
Very
to
true.
talking to folks working on these issues and thinking about how do we use this platform, right? And I think in that instance, we were certainly not alone, right? We saw what happened with that officer's knee on George Floyd. The world saw it, right? And everybody wanted to say something, right? Everybody felt it. Almost every corporation tried to do something, right? Some turned their, Facebook icons,
Black or
dark,
yeah.
right? Like, I think one of the things that we can do at Ben and Jerry's is speak truth to power. We have a platform. We talk to people and reach people that other advocacy organizations may not necessarily speak to, right? So we have this place in popular culture and in the world as, people, for better, for worse, and it's often for worse, corporations have a lot of power. And
They do.
and so when we're at our best, we're bold, we're using language that is real, that's authentic, and that is unapologetic, right? I think what you saw in the wake of George Floyd's murder, around all these corporations that wanted to say something, it wasn't the corporations actually that remained silent that were criticized. It was the corporations that tried to say something in a way that didn't offend anybody, right?
Yeah.
Like the NFL and their statement that didn't even use the word racism. Like, and so I think for us,
choice words versus
exactly,
being bold and daring and direct and honest.
And I think that's what we want to do. And we may not always get it right, but to your point, as a process, there's a relatively small team of us at Ben and Jerry's that manage this work. There's myself and my, a colleague of mine who manages. I have this global role. My colleague handles the kind of U.S. advocacy and activism, and then we have a core team of people on the marketing team who, they really own the keys to the communications channels that we use, and it is this partnership between the marketing team that is the sort of execution piece and the folks on my team that sort of manage the sort of content. And I think, on a piece like that, we sit down and start writing. It's a,
Hmm.
and the thing that we do is we work with our outside partners and allies to ensure that we are echoing their frames and their messages and their
Hmm.
policy solutions. So you will note that in addition to the statement, we call, I think, in that piece for four specific
Yeah.
pieces of policy, or three pieces of policy, and one telling stopping, Trump stop fanning the flames of racism, right? But I think being very clear about what that was and being clear about the kinds of steps that we could take to address the root causes are important in those communications. And then we write it out, we share it with our friends to make sure we're not getting something wrong. So, we
Hmm.
work closely with the Advancement Project, with Color of Change, with the team at NAACP. We stay, Dream Defenders. We stay connected to a broad network of activists and allies who do this work. And then we have the trust of the leadership at Ben and Jerry's that supports the work and gives us the latitude to do it. Because the truth is, I mean, let's be honest, many people who sit on the leadership team at Ben and Jerry's aren't necessarily the issue experts on this. They have enough trust in the team and the partners and the allies that we work with that,
Hmm.
we'll get it right. And so, something like that moves through a pretty quick approval process and we get it up and out.
Hmm.
And yeah, in that instance, that was one of the most widely engaged, read, shared pieces of content that the company's ever had, which is remarkable, and I think says a lot about this time and moment and the role of corporations than it says about anything we wrote, but it is fascinating.
It was something that you said in there about different organizations and companies putting out something, but I'll just say delicately walking around that issue. And this, I mean, we're talking about the re-energizing of the Black Lives Matter movement, if you will, but there's loads of other topics and issues where, the silence of companies is heard loudly, or the ways in which they go about their messaging. What would you say if you had a chance to? I'm thinking like you're Ben in this instance, only you're Chris, where you get to be you. And there's a room full of individuals who obviously don't have your exact role because, like we said, it is a very unique role, but they are responsible for DEI in their company and whatever that context might be. Maybe they're not the global chief, but the messaging, what do we respond to? The press releases, content creation, things of that sort. If you had an opportunity to share with them the importance of language and accuracy and precision and boldness when talking about these issues, whatever the topic may be, what would you say to them to encourage them to, if you're going to say something, let's not go this route, we should actually go this route, and here's why.
I think the first thing is you can't start from a place of not wanting to offend some
Mm,
people.
yeah.
These issues are hard, right? They are deeply rooted and ingrained in our culture, in our society, in our government, right? And so we collectively, if we are going to make progress on these issues, if we are ultimately going to be successful in deconstructing these structures that perpetuate systemic racism in society, we all have to deal with issues that are uncomfortable. We have to be comfortable in this space of uncomfortableness, right? And so
Yeah.
if we're setting about on this work thinking it's not
Mm-hmm.
going to be hard or it's not going to be uncomfortable, we're doomed to fail. I would urge people to embrace this space of uncomfortableness because that's where that's where the progress happens. And I think it's not easy and it's not hard and nobody likes their Facebook wall to blow up with people who disagree with you. What we have found and what we know to be true is that when you are real and authentic and you communicate the things that you believe, that will resonate with people. It doesn't mean everyone agrees with you. But I will tell you that, a lot of people look at Ben and Jerry's and they say, well, you guys can do that because you're Ben and Jerry's, right?
Mm.
But if you step back for a second and think about it, we're a company that sells ice cream, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based in Burlington, Vermont, founded by two hippie dudes. It's sort of like, if we can do it, why can't anyone do it? I mean, at the end of the day, there's no magic to why we can do it and others can't. The reason we do it is because we set about to do it.
We
Right.
choose
And
to
so
do
I
it.
think,
Yeah.
I think you can't start from a place of not wanting to be inoffensive. If you're inoffensive, you're likely irrelevant, right? That's one. Two, you have to build, I believe you are most effective if you build relationships with those who are impacted by the things that you are talking
Speaking
about and
about.
engaging
Yeah.
on, right? So
Mm-hmm.
how do you center historically marginalized communities and the people that are impacted by these issues in your communications and in the work that you're doing? Because when people push back at you, the worst place to be is to get it from both sides, right? Which is exactly what happened to the NFL, right? The people who are actually advocates for racial justice say that statement is pathetic and it doesn't even use the word racism. And then on the other hand, you have people telling the NFL to shut up and focus on football, right?
Yeah.
So we're fine with the idea that people disagree with us. We want to stand with people who are advocates of racial justice. And so if we're bold, if we're clear, if we are standing in solidarity and we are aligning ourselves with their messaging and their frames, they ultimately will stand with us, right? And that's, so I think, build a network of folks outside the four walls of your company who can help keep you honest and focused.
Mm.
And then the third bit is just to have a little bit of courage. It's
You do need a little bit of
counterintuitive to,
courage.
yeah, it's counterintuitive to think that if you say something that people don't agree with, that it'll be all right. I mean, this company, this little ice cream company, started in a dilapidated gas station 3/4 of a mile from where I'm sitting now, is now $1 billion company operating in almost 40 countries, right? Like, we've proven that you can be bold and you can be true to the things you believe and still be wildly successful. Our biggest customer is Walmart. We sell more ice cream in Walmart than anywhere else. I mean, in so many ways, we're so mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you know, we've kind of built this approach at Ben and Jerry's.
And it's interesting because you said, and the way you started and you brought it up again in the middle as you were responding, this idea of you cannot go into this work or try to respond to something related to this work with the goal that everyone's going to be happy. And that's a refrain that we hear often because, at Fearless, we do training education. It's like, but we need something for everyone and we need everyone to be okay. We don't want to upset anyone. And this idea of being uncomfortable makes even the idea of being uncomfortable makes people extremely uncomfortable. And for us as educators and consultants, it's like, well, that's where the learning sits. When you are uncomfortable and you have to sit within that and really investigate, why am I feeling uncomfortable? What am I navigating here? Is it power? Is it my privilege? Is it my position within, this particular system? And this idea of not wanting to alienate those that we work with. But there was something that you brought up in terms of like being multinational and Walmart being one of your largest, clients, if you will. This idea of not wanting to alienate people within Ben and Jerry's, but also not wanting to alienate customers. That's something that we also hear. Would you say that the response is almost the same in terms of a product-based business saying we don't want to alienate our customer base by speaking up on, women's rights or LGBTQIA plus rights, et cetera, et cetera. Would you say it'd be the same or slightly nuanced and different?
I think it's a mistake. Let me flip it. I think
Go
as a
for
way
it.
to answer your question. Ben had this insight many, many years ago, and we still, it's a quote we often talk about. And Ben's insight was the strongest bonds that you can create with customers, with your consumers, is around a shared set of values, right? And so those are relationships that are much deeper than just a product
The product or
transaction,
service.
right?
Yeah.
And so yes, there may be people who don't like our position on any of the issues that we take, but the flip side of that is there are people who deeply love us for it, right? And and it goes without saying, this is not why we do it. This is not why I do the work that I do. But I will tell you that people who know that we do this work and who support it are much more loyal as consumers. They don't buy Haagen-Dazs when it's on sale because they support the work that we're doing at Ben and Jerry's, right? And so if you are unwilling to take a position because you feel it may offend some consumers, you're also missing the flip side of that, which is
Mm-hmm.
creating these incredibly lasting bonds. So if you think about other companies that are kind of known for this kind of stuff. Companies like Patagonia, right?
Yeah, I
Companies
love
like
Patagonia. That's
Lush,
helpful. Yeah.
right? Companies like, to some degree, Nike, right? And some of the stuff they've done. Or even if you want to flip it to the other side of the political spectrum, Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby, right? Like those are all companies that have built strong, successful businesses by
Mm-hmm.
telling you what they believe in the world, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an antiquated model and it's old school to suggest that you have to be inoffensive to everybody. I think that's an old way of thinking. And I think citizens and consumers' expectations are changing, right? So you think about what happened last year in Georgia, right? In the wake of the 2020 election and the voter suppression laws passed in Georgia, right? And you saw Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines get pulled right smack dab into the middle of that fight, right? So these are companies that have committed to DEI inside their company, right? And they're doing whatever they're doing to promote and advance equity within their companies. And when there is an attack fundamentally on the
Company
rights of
values.
people of
Yeah.
color in their home states, at first they didn't want to take a position, but they ultimately got dragged into it, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
so many companies, whether you want to or not,
Yeah.
there is increasingly going to be pull from outside your company by consumers and campaigners and inside your company by employees to have a point of view on the things you say you care about. And so I think it's
Mm-hmm.
increasingly going to be hard for companies to stay on the sideline on these issues.
Listening to you say that just now, I know that it's no shock to you, and you've probably have heard it before. Maybe not at Ben and Jerry specifically, but colleagues, former colleagues, coworkers, just friends in different places. This idea of I might really want to take a stance against injustice. So we could be talking about rights for disabled folks, for trans folks, whatever it might be. There's so much happening right now, particularly with trans children in the US. And then in the last 3 weeks, it seems it's been significant uptick with bills passed in Texas or on the floor for voting in Texas and in Georgia, not Georgia, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always something in this idea that, okay, we want to take a stand and challenge this injustice. First, we recognize that it's injustice. It's not right, XYZ. But the idea that there's a risk to take. I can see and I've heard companies, and well, not the actual company, but folks within it really discussing what is this risk and how big, like, let's assess this, the damage potentially. And what do you say to that? And the reason why I'm connecting all these dots, because I think about the decision that was made from you all back in, oh my God, it's almost been a year, July of 2021, to no longer sell your ice cream within, occupied Palestine. Like, that's a risk considering the history with Israel and Palestine. How do you all weigh that risk? Does it even feel like anything has to be weighed based on just the values that you all were birthed with and you clearly still uphold?
It's a complicated question. I mean, the quick answer is my job is not to think about, selling more ice cream. I genuinely believe that when we act in a way that is authentic, that's real, that's true to our values, and that is
Mhm.
working with the progressive allies and activists that we work with, I think everything else sorts itself out. When we came out, I mean, we were probably one of the first national corporations to publicly come out in support of the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2016. I will tell you,
Mhm.
the phone literally rang off the hook at our corporate headquarters for 3 weeks
I was going
with
to say, for how
people
long?
screaming at us, saying we're terrorists, we hate cops, we're right? So, like, as long as you're lined up internally around this is what we do, this is
Yeah.
not necessarily the easiest way to sell ice cream, but it's the most impactful way to sell ice cream. I think everyone understands that's part of doing this. So I
Mhm.
think now there is an approval process for everything we do that runs through the organization, right? That runs through the chief marketing officer and the CEO and the board for things that are particularly potentially controversial, right? And it is the CEO's job to make sure that we remain profitable and that we, because at the end of the day, if we don't continue to grow the business, we don't have the platform that we have, right? So, but I think, on the issue that you mentioned, I think we felt like we had to take that decision in order to align our operations with the things that we believed in the world, and that we understood that not everyone would agree, and we took the decision, and the chips fall where they fall. And I will tell you again, last year was the biggest year in the company's history.
Mhm.
We did really well. The brand is strong. We're selling a lot of ice cream, and hopefully, using our platform to add some value to the world. And
I
so
think
I
I might have
think,
added to that. There's lots of ice cream in my freezer right now.
thank you. It also is true that unfortunately, people stuck at home for long periods of time are stuck at home, and ice cream is an affordable indulgence in a
Great
time
snack.
of, yes.
Yeah.
But I think, to your point, like, if you let that overtake you, you will never be authentic, and you will never be impactful because you're worried about the fallout. And I think
Yeah.
this only works when you can be real and authentic and bold and true to the things you believe. And I
Yeah.
think if you do that, you'll be fine.
And when I think about the last question, this idea of like being almost getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, not seeking to do this work to appease everyone and to make everyone happy. And there's this common thread that I just keep hearing from you with once you're deeply and firmly rooted in your values, you're able to withstand the risks, if you will, because, you mentioned with the press release in 2016 that phone is off the hook because they're saying you're anti-cop, cop killer. I mean, all the common phrasing that we hear in framing that we hear when you go for racial justice or racial equity. And then I can imagine, and I know I saw this myself, with the decision last summer in 2021 being accused of being anti-Semitic. I can imagine when pieces have come out in support of women's rights. It's, just preparing yourself, no matter what the stance is and the issue is, there is going to be some fallout or fallback. Let the chips fall where they fall, as you said. But if you're rooted in, if your roots are firm and strong, just like these systems that we're trying to disrupt and unroot, if you will, then you can handle that. And not that it makes this space more easy to navigate. It's just being prepared for this is not a new bouquet of roses every day. My gosh, when you're working on these pieces internally, so you and your colleagues, I know you said you have one team member who works on US stuff. I can imagine you have, based on your team being globally, there might be some that you go to for APAC or Latin America and so forth. What's this collaboration like? Do you all just start free flowing in a Google document? Is it like exactly I write my draft, you send me your what's this process like?
Someone typically takes a stab at a first draft on these things. Because of my role, it's often me that takes the first draft, but it's exactly right. We work through Google Docs. I think, the key is not to have too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You want to have some different perspectives, but you can't write by committee, right?
It'll never happen.
and so, what happens, I think, at so many companies and brands is, first, it doesn't start with somebody like me. It starts with often somebody either on a marketing team or at a marketing agency, right? So it starts in a marketing lens, which is always a watch out in my mind. And then it goes through 64 layers of approval that often includes a legal review. And that's not true for us. There's a core team typically of, I would say, 3 to 4 people that work on a piece like you referenced earlier. And that goes up to a couple of members of the leadership team and the CEO for a review. More often than not, there is very little sort of editing or wordsmithing at that level, and we're done. And, there's a bit of an info. If something's likely to generate some controversy or we think it has the potential to, we'll notify the consumer care line, because most of the time they're taking calls from people who didn't get enough cookie dough in their ice cream or got too much cookie dough in their ice cream. So we give them a heads up. We prepare them for that. So there's a little bit of internal inform. But keeping that team tight is the key to getting this right. Tight team connected to advocates outside the company that can validate we're headed in the right direction.
There was something in there because I can definitely see how starting something from marketing, whether it's internal marketing or external marketing service providers, that then finds its way into legal. The daringness, the boldness is usually stripped away just by nature of how that runs.
Totally. The edges, the more levels of approval and engagement that something like that goes through, the more the edges get sort of worn, right? Just because everybody's got a point of view on something. And I think, that by starting with somebody who has some, and I don't pretend to be by any stretch of the imagination an expert on these issues. I know people who are, and I don't mean this in any way disrespectfully of my colleagues in marketing. I couldn't do this work without them.
Absolutely.
But they're even further removed from these issues, right? Their job is to be smart people who sell ice cream. And so the magic is we use the same tools that we use to convince people to buy chocolate fudge brownie. We use those same tools and techniques to sell the idea that, racism is a function of systems and structures, not just individuals, right? And that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. So that's the idea. But you got to you want someone who has some issue expertise and is connected to those who really have the expertise to really be the owner of the content. And I think, look, there there are very strong forces that have an interest in perpetuating the status quo, right? And so going back to this idea of being inoffensive or not wanting to be uncomfortable, if you're going to truly be a part of this work, it requires upending the status quo. And that's
Yeah.
going to make some folks
Uncomfortable and
unhappy and
angrier, if
uncomfortable.
you
That's right.
will.
But I
Yeah.
mean, that's the work, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and so I think we have the ability to do it at Ben and Jerry's, and I don't, and it is also hard, right? I mean, there are people in the company that, like our consumer care line, or even people who work in our scoop shops, who are sometimes the target of people who disagree with us, and
Hmm.
that's it isn't easy, but I think
No,
people
it's not.
understand that it's important.
Yeah, I that thread, it just keeps like pulling through this, and it's not even an idea. I think it's safe to call it a fact or
Mm,
reality that dismantling Islamophobia is not an easy, fun going process that's full of, lovely beach walks and whatever your favorite food might be to eat. Like, it does require sometimes for you to put on a shield and recognize, like, what are you fighting for here? You're fighting for human rights. You're fighting for humanity. That fight might not be literally physical, folks, just to be clear here, but those who wish to uphold that status quo, they are equally standing firm, and there's something to be said about being prepared for what does it look like to stand up for, Jewish folks, for Muslim folks, disabled folks, Muslim disabled folks, and so forth and so forth. Political positions, you take them. It's something that Ben and Jerry's does, and as we have heard from Chris, does it boldly, and I'll throw in there with pride. Honestly, Chris, it has been a pleasure talking with you. I can hear your passion, your dedication, but all throughout, it's like these are clearly not just Ben and Jerry's values. The You can hear that these are yours as well, and it shows up in the work that you do.